All right, hello students. This presentation today is on the Nuremberg War Crime trials. Essentially, it was the downfall of the German army. So we're going to look at what happened during the trial and what took place in terms of the convictions and the sentences that were handed down. All right, so basically after the war, the Allies faced this huge task of cleanup, as you know, with all the bodies and the crematoriums and the death camps. But at the same note, in dealing with that, they also had to deal with charging those who were held responsible for their actions. So basically, this was the first time leaders would be criminally charged for their actions during a conflict. So what they did was they put together what's called an international military tribunal, which basically is a court that is comprised of people from various countries. So they wanted to make sure those people were punished who were involved, and mainly the high-ranking German officers. All right, so what was ironic about this was that the location. So it took place in Nuremberg, Germany, which is the same location where they had all these Nazi party rallies, but it'll be the same location that they would finally bring all these leaders of that party to justice. But they also did it to appease the Soviets, so it was a close proximity of Russia because they were also heavily involved in freeing of the Holocaust survivors or liberating them from the concentration camps. So they wanted to appease them as well. All right, so as you can see here, this is the layout of the Palace of Justice where the trial were held. They had to do a lot of extensive renovations because the building was in terrible shape due to the bombings. So as you can see from the layout, you had the French, the Soviets, the Americans, the British, all at prosecution tables because you had different prosecutors from each of those countries. And then you also had areas for the accused and the police and a VIP gallery. Dozens of reporters and the media were all there to watch the trials. All right, so it's just some information about who was represented in the actual trial. So yeah, United States Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who was chosen from the United States as the chief prosecutor. Roman Rudenko was the chief prosecutor for the Russians, and Sir Hartley Shawcross was the prosecutor from Great Britain. You had several judges on top of that. So not only did you have several prosecutors from different countries, you had several judges. So you had Francis Biddle, who's a former U.S. Attorney General and American Justice on the court. Henry de Vabris, I don't know how to say that last name, but he was a French justice on the court. Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, a British justice and president of the court, and Ion Timovic. I can't even try to say that last name. He was Major General of Jurisprudence and a Soviet justice on the court. And you can see, based on the pictures, where they were all sitting during the trial, and where the defendants sat behind them during the trial as well. All right, so all the defendants face various charges related to the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany during the war. Some of those were conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now, you need to know these charges because you're going to need to include them in your assignment that follows the video. Not all the defendants faced all charges. So some of them faced all these charges, some of them didn't. The trial lasted almost a little over half a year, 218 days exactly, and included a bunch of testimony from 360 witnesses. And then finally the verdict was announced on September 30th and October 1st. And the executions, which were typically the sentences that were handed down, was carried out on October 16th. So if you look at the dates, it was only 15 days from the end of the trial to when the executions took place. And if you know anything about our court system, people that are on death row, for instance, that are been convicted of crimes and they've been sentenced to death, they're on death row for years. So obviously this was expedited due to the circumstances of the situation, and based on the sheer number of people that were killed, I think they wanted to expedite it to bring some closure to the families of those who had lost so many people. All right, so you had 21 Nazi leaders who were tried, including one Martin Bormann, who was absent because he wasn't found. He had died later on in 1945. So basically, he fled and they couldn't find him. But they were also these were all top-ranking Nazis, and they faced this tribunal. Whereas those who had lower ranks, their sentences would be carried out in lower courts. 12 of those tried at Nuremberg were given the sentence of death by hanging, including Martin Bormann. Reichsmarshal and Chief of the Air Force Hermann Goering was sentenced to death. He was Hitler's heir apparent. Basically, he was kind of like the second in charge until days before the war, and then he kind of fell out of favor for whatever reason, I guess for differences of opinion. He was still sentenced to death, but he committed suicide using a cyanide pill 3 hours before his sentence could be carried out. Hans Frank, who was the governor and general of occupied Poland, was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946. Wilhelm Frick was the Minister of the Interior. Another high-ranking official was sentenced to death and was executed on October 16th. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Army Operations, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on the same date. But what's ironic here, a German appeals court found him not guilty of breaking international law, but obviously it was too late. It was 7 years later. Not sure why they looked into that 7 years later, but that's kind of interesting. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the chief of the Reich main security office. So he was in charge of the Gestapo and the SS. So he oversaw the concentration camps. So he was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946. You had the Chief of Staff of High Command of the Armed Forces, Wilhelm Keitel. He was also sentenced to death. Alfred Rosenberg, Minister of Occupied Eastern Territories, was also sentenced to death. And Fritz Sauckel, the labor leader, sentenced to death by hanging on October 16th. And then Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Commissioner of the Netherlands, was also sentenced to death. And then finally, Julius Streicher. So this guy was the editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer and the director of the Central Committee for the Defense Against Jewish Atrocity and Boycott Propaganda. So essentially, he was in charge of all propaganda against the Jews. So he was in charge of the pamphlets, the newspaper, the media, everything that was utilized to convince people that Jews need to be, wiped off the face of the earth. They were terrible for Germany, etc., etc. Then you had Joachim von Ribbentrop. He was a minister of foreign affairs, another high-ranking official. So 3 of the remaining 10 defendants were acquitted, the last 3 of all charges, which is kind of interesting. Don't necessarily know why, but these other gentlemen were all given between 10 to 20 years in prison. Erich Radolf and Rudolf Heiss and all these other people were given life sentences, and they were also released early, and one of them died in prison. So later on, following the Nuremberg trial, they had smaller trials of German and Japanese war criminals, people that were involved in heinous acts. Other war criminals who escaped were also brought to justice through what were called Nazi hunters and Israeli Mossad. So these are people that literally tried to find Nazis who were involved in these atrocities and hunt them down and kill them. So their own form of justice. All right, so that concludes this particular presentation of the Nuremberg War Crime trials. Keep in mind, you want to make sure you read the write-up in Edmodo following this video so you can follow those directions and submit your assignment online.